our ethos has very much been against the idea of a kind of template or blueprint approach to each of the methods in that book. And so we have taken great care in writing the book and editing it to ensure that as far as possible, we explain the particular context and the particular factors at play, rather as Beth did and all the other panelists in their respective examples, on the ground in whichever city it was, or where it was a joint methodology of more than one in those cases. And to distill, as far as we can understand, what the, as it were, magic ingredients were that made it effective in that context. And secondly, providing guidelines to teams elsewhere who wish to adapt and adopt that sort of methodology to try to make it as locally appropriate as possible, because the idea of a transplant or a replication is, for the reason that Beth again just mentioned now in her response on COVID, anathema. And each of these things has to be done and dovetailed and made locally appropriate. That's the good side. The downside, of course, is it takes a little bit more time, it takes some research, and it takes some effort to work through all those parameters to make it effective, and we can't say how long that will take. That, in a shorthand, is also one of the challenges that we've all faced in our respective contexts. And if you look at the broader literature on co-creation, co-design, co-production, that is replete. Where people try to transplant something, it almost certainly doesn't work, precisely because it hasn't been made relevant to the local context and the local circumstances. So that is one of our guiding messages, as it is through the other books and the outputs, that we do not represent an attempt to find a magic bullet, a silver bullet, a template, a blueprint, or any of those words. Just the same as we don't talk about expert knowledge, we talk about best practices, we talk about guiding principles, in a way that helps, hopefully, other people to figure out how to make these sorts of approaches, to utilize these sorts of methods in ways that make sense on the ground in each of the local contexts. And bearing in mind that what we said earlier about consensus not always being achievable, and therefore needing to think about ways of breaking log jams in a way that enables things to move forward. And crucially, that it also addresses the power relations, which may be invisible, they may be implicit, but are no less potentially disruptive or insidious for that reason. And that is something that we're also emphasizing in the literature. You'll find it written up in both these books and most of the others. It's the elephant in the room in so much co-creation, co-production work. And most people somehow are afraid to address it or pretend it's not a problem. And I'm proud to say that we have actually sought to tackle and to address it and make it as explicit as possible without, as it were, short-circuiting the work. But whether one can challenge successfully power relations ultimately in the search of accelerating the transitions that we need into more substantive transformations to urban sustainability in the context of climate, environmental change, COVID, pandemics, any of the other wicked problems or societal problems and challenges that we face, remains something of an open question, and of course provides very fertile ground for further research as part of these ongoing processes. So much of what we have done actually is a kind of action research. We've been self-reflective, we've been reflexive, we've been trying to learn for ourselves as we've gone through these processes, as well as trying to pull out these key lessons in a sort of summative way, if you like, represented in these books and the manuals in a way that hopefully makes them both accessible, but also interesting and useful for teams elsewhere wishing to work and experiment innovatively in all these ways.